Jason, can you tell us about the Alliance to Save Energy and also
Sure.
your efforts working with cities in the area of sustainability?
Sure, but just to make a little bit of Mike's case here, there's the old great quote from Mayor LaGuardia who said there's no Republican or Democratic way of taking out the trash. You either do it or you're out. So you got to get it done. I love that story. Listen, I don't know if I see Mayor Nutter out there, but I'm going to quote another Philadelphia mayor who once said, "I promise to be brief, no matter how long it takes." That was Mayor Street. And he did. He took it as long. I'm with the Alliance to Save Energy. We're a great historic organization born in 1977, the same year as the Department of Energy. We were formed by two senators, Chuck Percy, a Republican from Illinois, and a Democrat, Hubert Humphrey, from Minnesota. And we're all about advancing energy efficiency. We're all about cutting waste, but energy waste. And we often say that energy efficiency is the fastest, the cheapest, the easiest, the most abundant energy resource. So we do everything in our capacity to actually advance and promote technologies and solutions that get us to a more energy efficient country and world and planet. And there's a ton of economic benefit to that. But I wanted to just back up a little bit and tell a little bit of story that gives us a little bit more context in the relationship to this event and this panel. Again, for 40 years, we've been all about energy efficiency. And the business case for energy efficiency is so apparent, so upfront, it's so clear. Cities around America, states around America, the federal government has embraced this as a great solution. But about 5 years, we pioneered a term called energy productivity. And in fact, somebody who just asked a question in the previous panel, Kateri Callahan, my predecessor, deserves a line credit for developing this term, because it's not just about using less energy, it's about maximizing every unit of energy to get as much economic output and productivity as you possibly can. So as we now know, in places like California, yes, it's about how much energy can you save, but it's also about when you use that energy. So there's new ways, there's new technologies, there's sensors and controls about using using energy in the best, most strategic possible way, and that's a very evolving conversation. And what I like about it is it gets us to what I think is the most fundamental question of this day and this panel is, what are we trying to be smarter for? What's the output? Yes, the alternative to not being a smart city is obvious, right? Nobody wants to be the dumb city. But I mean, these mayors in these cities are being asked so much. They want to be the most sustainable city. They want to be the most resilient city. They want to be the healthiest city. They want to be the energy and resource efficient city. They want to be an innovative city. I mean, how do they do all that? I tell you, the great enabler is the Smart Cities rubric. So getting smarter lets them do all those things, achieve all those great goals that they've actually, as Mike and I know, he had a lot to do with the formation of the C40. How do you get to those big, bold, sustainable, and resilient goals? Not to mention, how do you be more efficient and more effective on social services? So energy efficiency and the sustainability story as it relates to where we're going to get smarter is helping drive that, and I'm excited to talk more about that. But it's a full landscape. I mean, we're getting smarter. We have to get smarter much faster for a whole variety of reasons so we can knock off multiple challenges and multiple problems.
Thank you. Matt, if I could skip over you and go to the other Matt. I could do that. He's a colleague. But Matt, can you tell everyone about Electrify America?
Sure. So Electrify America is a new company. We were created about a year ago, and we are a wholly owned subsidiary of Volkswagen Group of America. We are investing $2 billion over the next 10 years in EV infrastructure and education and awareness programs. And the underlying goal of that investment is to drive adoption of zero-emission vehicles. The way our investment, the way our structure works is we invest over cycles. So it would be a really bad idea to plan a $2 billion investment over 10 years right now and go implement. Because 7 years from now, you'd be implementing all sorts of bad decisions. And so we invest over 4 cycles, and we're in our first cycle right now. And we're planning our second cycle, which is a $500 million investment that'll start in the middle of next year. The underlying goal, the major areas of investment for us on the city side is that we are investing in 17 what we call beachhead communities. These are the communities where the adoption of EVs has already occurred or is projected to be aggressive in the next couple years. And in addition to the 17 beachhead communities that we're investing on the infrastructure side, we selected Sacramento, California to be our first green city, where we'll be investing in a whole host of different activities, basically creating access to zero-emission vehicles for those who do not own them through car share, ride hail, shuttle, and charging infrastructure. The third major pillar of our investment is what we believe to be the largest network of non-proprietary DC fast charging along the highway corridors of the U.S. built to date. It's a $265 million investment being made basically between now and 11 months from today. And it will go from, we have 5 operational stations today, we'll be at 480 operational stations by sometime in the middle to end of next year.
That's awesome.
The only other kind of really important thing to emphasize is that when we started this effort, we looked at where the zero emission space has been, and it's been kind of a massive problem of chicken and egg. The cars do not have capacity to do ultra fast charging, and so the stations have not been deployed with that capacity. We are going to deploy all of our highway network will be what we refer to as ultra fast charging, which has the capacity to refuel a vehicle at 20 miles of range per minute. So you pull in, you're there for 10 minutes, you leave, you've got a full tank of electricity. Everything that I was just describing there is only that first cycle of investment, that first $500 million. So we're currently planning our second cycle of investment. We are a data-driven company, and one of our core principles is each cycle of investment is a blank sheet of paper exercise. So we threw out all of our past assumptions, all of our past data, and have been building a new model of investment targeting what we believe will be needed in the EV ecosystem over the next 2.5 years. At its core, we think that there are a lot of lessons to have been learned in the EV space. I came from the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy made really the largest investment to date in EV infrastructure, and it was very much a mixed result. Some of the investments did not pan out long term, and from a financial perspective. And so when we set out on this task, we've set a very long-term ambition of having a network that can survive, that can be economically sustainable, and can continue to benefit communities for decades to come.
Thank you. And Matt, Joe, and Elliot both described Denton's, but maybe you could touch a little bit about our environmental practice, but in particular, how is that playing into the whole smart cities area? And is environmental law becoming an impediment to the advances of smart city innovation?
Sure. Matt Adams, I lead the Environment and Natural Resources team at Denton's. I'm based in San Francisco, which explains the coffee, but the team is coast to coast, and there is an awful lot of interest in the smart cities concept throughout. As Clint said, right at the top, there's no clear definition of what exactly that concept is, but 3 things that we see as being sort of consistent themes in the communities where we work are environmental health, sustainability, and the equitable distribution of those goods. So we're very proud to work with cities, with private sector, with NGOs, and with Indian tribes who are interested in furthering those things. On the question of the role of environmental law, I think some of the things we're seeing are that a lot of innovation is happening outside of traditional environmental regulatory spaces, as Michael was starting to get into. But I'm not sure that means there's no role for environmental regulation in the smart city. Quite the opposite. You know, those themes that I just mentioned, the things that seem to be resonating in the community, you know, environmental policy, environmental regulation sets the standards, creates the field within which innovation can help us get there. The other thing I would just flag to your question, Eric, is sort of the catalyst role that environmental regulation can help play. So some of the obstacles that were mentioned on the first panel really involve the challenges, both political and practical, of doing the long-range coordination and planning that's necessary for an effective smart cities program. You know, one of the things that we see is that environmental regulation or statements of environmental policy can help cut through that a little bit. So one example, in the aftermath of Paris, of course, there were a number of cities that set their own targets for greenhouse gas reduction. We were asked to take a look at the municipal planning efforts that came out of those targets earlier this year, and one of the things we found was that most were so aggressive that they can really only be achieved with a kind of deep decarbonization of the transportation sector and significant improvements in building efficiency that you would need to have smart cities infrastructure for. Another example, this one from California, where a state law really requires local communities to have their own enforceable, sustainable community plans to meet certain greenhouse gas reduction targets. Those plans, if you take a close look at them, end up rolling up a lot of smart city infrastructure programs. And quite often they have numbers next to the line items. And so you see environmental law playing this catalyst function where it sort of creates the framework within which all the stakeholders, and Clint, I agree with you, it's got to include utilities, play the long-term planning role that's needed.
Thank you. At the end of the previous panel, there was a question asked about, you know, what cities stand out. But so let's get a little bit more specific. And Michael, what cities are you working with at Rubicon, and what cities stand out? What kinds of things are you doing with those cities?
Sure, and I like the earlier answers when they said, I'm not going to answer that. Those were all good answers. All those cities are doing an amazing job. We're working with a diverse group of cities, Atlanta, Santa Fe, Columbus, Montgomery, just to name a few. A few other big ones I'm not able to mention yet, but they're in the top 10 population-wise. But I want to talk about Atlanta because that's where our company's based. That was our first engagement. And that's where I think right now, because the product that I'm talking about, the Rubicon Smart City product, is new. It's about 18 months old. And the thing is taking off very quickly. Demand's high. But you know, just to create a tech product, that's not, okay, great, someone has a tech product. But what is the impact? Because every one of us in this room, right, there's no smart city without the city government and without the city as the client and the laboratory in which we do our work. So it has to be about impact. So we put our technology into Atlanta's fleet of about 80 waste and recycling vehicles servicing 96,000 households, which represents all of Atlanta. You're probably surprised by that. The city of Atlanta's population is about 400,000 people. It's the metro area. That's the broader 5+ million. So for 6 months, the trucks went up and down every single street and collected lots of data and did lots of stuff. And at the end of it, we said, okay, here's what we found. And the first thing we found was we could potentially save the city $700,000 a year. Okay, anyone could say we could potentially do something, right? And I sent this number in and said, oh, I don't know about this. You know, how are we going to prove this? Well, good news is, fast forwarding, we now have a contract with the City of Atlanta, and we have proven that. And we saved that within a matter of weeks, simply by optimizing the routes of vehicles. This wasn't rocket science. The garbage trucks basically came from two places, and the guys over here and the women over here service places over here, and these folks went over here every morning. I mean, like, we could all figure this out ourselves, right? I don't want to undersell our product, but the point is, some of this stuff is really basic. And so that was the cost savings. So we had to lead with the cost savings for the city and say, our product costs this, we can save you this. Now can we have a conversation? So then what were the next level things that are, I think, intellectually more interesting? Well, getting rid of this, right? Cut down on vehicle miles traveled. That had direct correlation to less money spent on road maintenance and improvement. It had a direct number that we could provide them on carbon avoidance. We have that verified by a third party, so the city can then put that into their reporting back to things like the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities or C40 or other, international organizations where they report on that. We also looked at driver behavior, because that's important as well. Everything from hard braking and turning, kind of the stuff that FedEx and UPS do about don't make left turns against lights. We looked at all of that stuff to try to improve that. That had a direct impact on the daily pickup of people's trash. It was getting picked up on time. Beyond that, we looked in the waste, and this is where it really, this is infrastructure, transportation, and environment. So the environmental impacts we were talking about, fewer vehicle miles traveled, that's good, but it's not great, right? What Atlanta really needed to nail was the recycling rate was here, and they needed to get up here. So we said, well, what's the problem? Let's analyze the problem first. So we analyzed all the waste. We took pictures of it. We put it into our algorithm, and it said, basically, people in Atlanta throw away garbage with plastic bags. They shouldn't do that. Don't put your recycling in a plastic bag. 89% of Atlantans do that. So we were able to say to them, that's your policy problem. Don't spend $100,000 giving flyers to everyone, reminding them what to recycle. Go to these 42% of Atlantan homes and tell them to stop doing this, and go to these homes and tell them to do this instead. So they were able to target their money better, and they've seen their recycling rate or the lack of contamination improve. So those are some examples of what we've done so far.
Excellent, excellent. Jason, can you share some examples of the
Sure.
smart city technologies?
Look, I think, cities around the country are embracing smart cities and smart city technologies and solutions. A couple things that stand out to me. In New York, and Mayor Bloomberg was already evoked, and he used to, every speech I ever saw him make, it felt like he said, you can't manage what you don't measure. It was like an MO of his. And in transportation and certainly in buildings, we're seeing this explosion of sensors and controls and the need to kind of measure everything. And in Con Ed's, as an example, they're investing not quite $2 billion, but they're investing $1.3 billion in smart meters. So they can actually measure everything better. And if you're not measuring it, you certainly can't be smart about it. So that's a huge deal, and I think that trend is taking off around the country. The other thing, I also come from the Department of Energy, so I know we've got some other alums, and another one coming at lunch. But there's even smaller things, like in San Francisco, DOE, and when I was there, we helped develop this unique building ID. For every building, so you could understand, it was actually using blockchain technology, so you could identify a building down to the square meter, because as it turns out, when you try to identify a building across databases, so whatever your database is, whether it's about housing, whether it's about energy, whether it's about just any social service, they all use address, and when you start to add up those layers of databases and you try to make sure that you're talking about the same building, they don't know. And so this has happened in the building sector, and we built out this unique building ID to solve that problem. Again, it was a parochial problem, but has huge ramifications for how we think about buildings in the future. San Francisco is helping pilot that and roll it out for every building in its entire city. Again, that's huge. I also think of the story of street lamps. You know, back in 2006, 2007, I think every city was plagiarizing each other, doing a street lighting campaign, and we're going to retrofit street lights, and we're putting in LEDs. We're so excited. Now it's not barely even a sustainability play. It's about putting in the wireless sensors, understanding what's going on with traffic, what's going on with congestion. It's a huge safety play. It can help reduce crime. And so that's being used in really interesting and creative ways. But ultimately, I think that, and this is really the wisdom of Clint and Denton's, in that there is no framework for what a smart city designation looks like. And most importantly, at least at the city level, what are you doing in terms of creating a framework to enable you know, these types of capacities? Because for cities, that's what it's about. It's a capacity and capability focus and motivation. They want to be better at governance. And being smarter obviously lets them do that. And just one last final point on that. I really like what DOE did with this program called Soul Smart. And essentially across permitting and codes and zoning and everything else, they said, if you want to be solar ready as a community, here's all the things that you need to do. Here's all the enabling policy. Here's the enabling framework that needs to be put in place to be a Soul Smart designated city. And cities around the country go, oh yeah, let's do it. Check off all the things we need to do. Same with smart cities. It is such a huge opportunity for these cities, but they don't know the roadmap. I don't know if anybody's written the roadmap. And we've got these great examples of the technologies and the solutions that are out there, but we don't have the framework, and we certainly don't have the roadmap that cities can grab onto. I will just highlight Baltimore, though. I really like what they've done. They rolled out recently an inclusive digitization market transformation strategic plan. I may be butchering it a little bit, but they sat down and tried to come up with a 5-year strategic plan to do just that, to put together that type of framework.
So Matt Nelson, you talked about $500 million that you put out to 17 cities. How did you decide which cities to deploy those resources?
It's a good question. So it's a $500 million investment in the first cycle. $85 million is focused specifically on these 17 metro areas. And as a data-driven company, we built a model. We looked at where the vehicles are, where the vehicles are projected to be, layered on utility factors. There's a big difference in the economics of an electric vehicle charging station based on utility policy and utility rates. And then layered a policy filter on top of that, trying to identify the communities that, due to their policy environment, are likely to drive ZEV adoption more quickly. There's a lot of data or a lot of research out there now that's been driving home the questions of which policies actually drive ZEV adoption. And there's a lot of policies that don't, or that statistically don't have an effect. But a few policies, such as a famous one is access to HOV lanes or toll lanes for electric vehicles. It's famous in the Bay Area because basically if you cross the Bay Bridge, you buy an electric vehicle now. But it's true, there's good data that shows it's a hugely effective policy wherever it's been deployed. Statistically demonstrable effectiveness. Incentives, other things, incentives, requirements, fleet support are the other major ones on the vehicle side. And then from a city perspective, there's a very clear emerging trend. Installing stations is expensive. This is an underappreciated fact. These are massive cost investments. We think that our investment of $500 million in this first cycle addresses only 10% of the need, to 10 to 15% of the need to fill the gap in charging infrastructure. So in that environment, we need to find others to invest in the space, such as utilities or local and state government. But the other thing we need to do long term is find a way to make this all cheaper. And by far the best thing we can do at a city level is building codes. Because this stuff costs nothing to lay in when you're building the building. It's you're laying conduit in your parking structure already. It's just a matter of what gauge you use, what panel size you use. I mean, nothing is the wrong term, but it's a very incremental cost increase. And so we've seen some real leadership from Atlanta, from Boston, from actually the whole state of California, saying all new buildings need to be properly wired for EV charging in the future. I think those are the major areas so your question was how we picked our cities. We took those 4 elements, where the cars are going to be, the policy environment, and the utility environment, built a matrix, and followed the data.
So we actually, I want to give a shout out to, we have a Fulton County Commissioner from the Atlanta region, Liz Hausman, who's here. And there's been 2 positive comments made about Atlanta, but I live in Atlanta, but I also want to say, policy can really impact the way certain decisions are made. And Atlanta was not one of the 17 cities. And for those that may not be aware, Atlanta, the state of Georgia, was number 2 in the nation in terms of electric vehicles because they had an electric vehicle tax credit. And in 2015, the state legislature revoked that tax credit, and there was a 90% drop in electric vehicles in the state of Georgia, and now put the state at the back of the pack. So it just shows you how policy really can have an impact. So Matt, anything you want to add with regards to environmental law as it relates to some of this innovation in these cities?
Yeah, no, I think everything that's been said so far is right on. There's sort of a delicate balance to be struck here. On the one hand, you have the ability of environmental law and policy to sort of set the incentives so that smart city initiatives actually deliver the kind of environmental and sustainability and mobility benefits that we're all looking for, right? On the other hand, traditional environmental permitting and environmental review requirements also apply to the deployment of some of this infrastructure. So it's important to get the balance right, make sure that what we're doing is setting the right incentives, but not creating an environment where the innovation that results from those incentives is delayed in its deployment.
So, Michael, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention this, but you had, I believe, you have entered into a partnership with Amazon.
I hope so. Now you said it.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Totally. And of course, you can mention that. I want to answer it by going back to what Matt was talking about, because from where I sit, there are really 2 policy drivers for not just our product, but more broadly for smart cities. So there's the environmental policy driver. And in our world, talking about waste and recycling stuff, that's very useful. So every time a city says we are banning plastic bags, or we will no longer allow styrofoam to go to a landfill, that's good for us because we make money by keeping stuff out of landfills, and it's good for the planet. So that alignment, I think, is pretty clear. But what Eric's referring to is this partnership we announced last week with Amazon. And this is where I think the big issue is for all of us who are actually trying to create smart cities. The environmental policies will happen. They'll happen more quickly in places like California and New York, and they'll happen differently in other parts of the country. And then we'll have places like Atlanta that really come out of nowhere all of a sudden and lead the pack, and people say, wow, it can happen in any corner. Procurement. It's procurement. It all comes down to procurement. We could have the best ideas in the world. The mayor can say, I want to do this. And the head of the solid waste department could say, please, let's pilot this together. And then all of a sudden the procurement department says, well, hold on. We have to have a competitive process. We can't pilot this technology. Okay, right? We all want to make sure everything's done properly. But now a year and a half has passed, and this thing that I'm trying to pilot has already become obsolete. I've changed it. My company changes our technology every 2 weeks. Every time your phone sends you a push notification to update your app, that's a tech company updating the tech. So if it takes me a year and a half or 2 years to simply pilot something, and the pace of tech has come here. So what have we done with Amazon? Amazon said, this is bad. We need to improve this. The pace of change needs to align with the customer experience that we all have with Amazon. So they've created something called the Amazon Web Services Marketplace, and they have a public sector vertical. And so we're one of their earliest companies, and now cities can go online to AWS, Amazon Web Services Marketplace, and they can actually buy our tech or pilot our tech literally with one click. Just like you buy diapers and Coca-Cola and whatever else. Coca-Cola was for your benefit in Atlanta. All of the T's and Q's have been crossed off. All the legalese is there, but the big innovation is most cities have cloud computing accounts with companies like Amazon or other tech companies, so they can buy us through that purchasing vehicle. So we think this will be a real innovation to speed up the rate of at least experimentation and innovation, but within a framework that is permissible for procurement folks.
Excellent. Jason, you when we talked prior to the panel, you'd mentioned transportation 50 by 50. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So we have an initiative and a transportation commission that's looking at an opportunity to reduce energy by 50% in the transportation sector by 2050. And again, it actually aligns with this energy productivity. Let's match the needs of the transportation sector by 2050, but still be able to cut energy use in half. And it really means driving innovation. And how do you do that? And there's obviously going to be a huge component on the electric vehicle side, and I'll defer to Matt on that. There's a huge opportunity there, and what do we do? What do we need to put in place to do that? There's also, and it's actually a really interesting innovation question, because it's all speculative, is what do we do with autonomous vehicles and the rise of autonomous vehicles? So we're actually in the midst of trying to map out the modeling. We're actually working with NREL. Martin Keller is on the commission, and they're trying to model what happens with AVs, and it's a really actually intellectually stimulating question, because the literature varies from it could reduce vehicle miles traveled by 60%, or on the flip side, it could increase VMT by 600%. So when you start mapping, and again, this is all speculation. This is
Same model,
me.
just different assumptions.
Right. I was about to say. So this is what assumption do you pick? Because again, you've got all this literature already in place that's saying what's going to happen, and so it was funny because Scott Keogh, who's the CEO of Audi America, was sitting at the meeting, and he goes, we have to imagine that it's 1988, and we're mapping out what to do in 2020. It's the same thing. We're now in 2018, and we're trying to map out what happens in the next 10 years, the next 20 years, the next 30 years. And we're talking about a technology that we know is coming, but in terms of really knowing how to be enabling, how to be open, how to be flexible, how to make sure that we're not cutting off, making decisions that cut off innovation and cut cities off at the knees. Again, it's extremely opaque, and a lot of it's speculative. So again, I think the answer there on transportation is really what Matt said. We have to be looking at this very often. We have to make sure. I think we have to keep an eye on the policy frameworks that are in place, both at the local, the state, and the federal level. I guess there's already an AV-related bill that's circulating through Congress. Again, I don't know how many of you guys really want the regulation on the future of mobility to happen at Congress right now. Yes, maybe there's an opportunity, but there's a question mark. But I'm really encouraged about what I am seeing at the state level. We were in Pittsburgh, and they've got 2 AV startups that are up and running, and they're doing thousands and thousands of hours of testing. So far, pain-free, crash-free. But what's interesting about that is, they're having conversations with the mayor about the future of this, and they're saying, well, what happens? Does the autonomous vehicle how does it get a license? And I was talking to some friends about this the other day. I mean, they're talking through these questions of the future, and they're trying to do it on the fly. So.
Yeah, we have at Denton's a global autonomous vehicle group, a team with over 50 lawyers and professionals all around the globe. And we're tracking what's happening all around the globe. And it's coming, and it's coming fast. And I'm not sure that we're prepared for it. The bills in Congress they're stalled in the Senate right now. But there are 30+ states that have already passed laws and regulations, and independently of what the federal government does, but it's going to have an impact on cities and communities. I was talking with my colleague Steve Leibovitz earlier today at breakfast about how 40% of the revenue that comes into Hartsfield-Jackson Airport is from parking revenue. Well, if you have autonomous fleet vehicles, you have bond financing that's backed by parking revenues. I mean, how are we going to deal with those kind of challenges, especially at the speed that they're all coming? So,
Absolutely.
A whole host of issues.
Yeah.
Well,
Big ripple effect.
Yeah, we could obviously continue this conversation for hours, but I'd like to throw it open to the audience, and if anyone has any questions for any of the panelists. In the back.
Good morning, thank you all. I imagine you can't have a transportation environment discussion without mentioning maglev and Hyperloop and mass transit. So I was wondering if you could make some comments on what you think about that.
Anyone want to comment? I don't know that we have
It's
the
not in our-
expertise here,
it's
but
not in our area of expertise.
yeah.
Is
Like-
there anyone in the
Wait-
audience who has the expertise?
Waiting to give it a try.
Yeah.
I would imagine it'd be part of smart cities. I mean, if we
I
can go
think-
from Washington DC to Baltimore in 15 minutes, that's,
Well, I know that
That seems pretty
there's efforts all across the country looking at high-speed rail. I mean, one of the challenges is cost and how quickly you could build it. I know, a lot of communities, cities, and communities around cities are looking at bus rapid transit because it's a lot quicker to deploy than building out rail or maglev system. But it's clearly something that's being talked about. I mean, do you have any thoughts on it? Did you like to share with the group?
I think it's fantastic that we're talking about it. It's sad to see, at least I'm making broad generalizations for my generation, that at some point we, in America, were leading on some of these issues, and now to see that Japan has had bullet trains for several decades, and I look around and say, why can't I get to New York, and why can't I go to my jobs there? When at the same time I'm also seeing videos about flying cars, and so it just seems a little disconnected of where I wish that we would be, and maybe some of the policies or financial investment that needs to happen in order to back that to get us there.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head, the financial investment. I think the cost is probably the biggest obstacle. Other questions? Yes.
Just if I could take a chance to respond to her
Sure.
question. So my name's Todd Dobert. I'm the head of our Telecom Technology Privacy Data Security Group. And what you've hit on is when it comes to smart cities, you've heard several parties talk about cost. And one of the keys to really being successful as a country, as communities, as cities, is learning how to be efficient about the infrastructure upgrades that we need to make so that we can spread the cost across various different interest groups. That's really what we're talking about over and over and over again, whether it's power, whether it's telecom, whether it's transportation like high-speed rails. So if we can figure out how to take the work that we need to do, the physical work, to improve our infrastructure, and at the same time install the telecommunications facilities that we need, the power that we need, all of these things at the same time, at one time, according to a plan, then it will start to make sense because we will reduce the cost impact to any one user group by more than tenfold. And if you can do that, you make these projects possible. If we can't get alignment on it, it's not going to happen because nobody's going to want to pay and nobody's going to see the benefit that comes to them.
Just quick comment on that front. I grew up in Reston, Northern Virginia, and since I was in middle school, they were talking about getting Metro out to Reston and then out to Dulles Airport. So it was a 20-year journey, and they're just now getting it out to Reston, and they're on their way to getting out to Dulles. So infrastructure is hard. It takes a lot of coordination. I'm sure there's a lot of regulatory hurdles and barriers that you have to overcome, and obviously the investment and the financial cases has to be made.
Yes, sir. Oh, okay.
Hi, Emma Hand with Denton's, and I have a question for Matt Nelson. As you're working with cities and rolling out the EV charging grid, are cities paying a lot of attention to things like hurricane evacuation routes, making sure that there's adequate charging structure when you have, because we've now had Katrina, we've had Hurricane Sandy, where you've had major metropolitan areas hit by a predictable disaster where the city's going to be charging and evacuating at the same time. And so what kind of work is being done around those issues to make sure that when that starts to happen, that the grid is there to support the need of the city?
I don't know. There was a big story at I can't remember which recent hurricane in Florida, but one of the elements of how different EV technology is that Tesla downloaded software to their EVs that allowed the driver to access more of the battery for a 1-week period of time during the hurricane, and it substantially increased the range of the vehicle. And then they took it away a week later.
Wow.
The drivers were a little confused about, but it shows how different charging technology and EV technology is, and how advanced these vehicles are. They are really, smart is the topic. These vehicles are so much more sophisticated than the classic internal combustion engine. They're updated just like an iPhone on a weekly basis or more often. They're constantly being improved. They can do things like improving braking systems over the air. So it's a little bit different world. Specific to your question, we fundamentally believe that EV adoption is the single largest barrier to EV adoption in the mass market context, and most importantly, as a primary car, not the secondary car that you only use to go to the grocery store once a week. So specifics on that. 68% of all EVs today are secondary or third or fourth cars in the home. So people buy an EV, but then they drive an SUV all the time. And we think that the fundamental solution to that is a nationwide network of charging stations that work just like gas stations. And so, and we believe that they need to be built along major highway corridors, which are the primary evacuation routes. So across the whole Southeast, we're building along almost every major highway to enable people to use those cars to evacuate. And we're building extremely large, fast stations. So 4 to 10 chargers per charging station with more, sometimes up to 2 megawatts of power delivered, able to recharge a vehicle in 10 to 15 minutes. That's the model that we think enables the car to become a primary car.
And the cost of battery technology is declining so rapidly. And Matt and I were talking yesterday about how I think we're only a few years away from where it's actually going to be cheaper to buy an electric vehicle than a combustible engine vehicle. But you need the infrastructure in place. Other questions? I think there was a question back here.
I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, I guess this one's for Matt as well. You're putting the stations in, but how far away are we from actually mobile charging as you're driving down a lane? Maybe it would be a secondary lane, but you would be traveling and charging as you go for, you know, X number of feet or whatever. Is that far out in the future? Would that be a consideration by your group?
Well, there are two ways to answer that. There is that now, if you have the wires above the lane, you see it in some of the really old metro systems, bus systems, they do that, but it's extraordinarily expensive and not very user-friendly. If you talk about inductive charging, so basically over air from the, where we are in inductive charging is that there is workable inductive charging in a specific location. You pull the car over it, it can recharge. It's very slow compared to DC fast charging, so it's an overnight solution, and it's extremely expensive. And so the open question is, what use case does it serve? If I'm willing to drive into my specific spot, am I willing, is it really a burden to walk around the car and plug it in once every couple nights? And we don't think at this point, and then finally, just to be clear, inductive charging exists, but it is not commercialized. And so we can't deploy non-commercial activities because there would be no customer base. So the vehicles, they're kind of both getting there, but there's a real fundamental question of what's the problem it is solving, and could it, and does that problem, if people are really opposed to plugging in, it might actually be cheaper to design a robot to plug into your car than to design inductive charging. So, but it's just to be clear, it's something we continue, these 4 cycles, one of the core principles is we relook at all these things. And so we're only in our 2nd cycle. 5 years from now, inductive charging may be the path to go. We think that'll probably be stationary inductive charging to support autonomous vehicles. I think the cost of actually putting that infrastructure into the roadway would be very substantial.
In short, not anytime soon.
Well, Matt, Matthew, Jason, Michael, thank you very much. This was an excellent discussion.
Okay.
Thank you.